The first time it happened, I laughed because I thought it was a prank, like my brother was finally trying to be funny. But then my mom walked right past me in my tux like I was a coat rack and asked my wife if she wanted more champagne. I said, "Mom, I am right here," and she kept her eyes on my wife's face like I was background noise in my own reception. Then my dad clinked his glass, welcomed everyone, thanked the staff, thanked my brother, thanked my wife's parents, and never said my name once, and I felt my throat tighten in a way that made swallowing hurt. We were at a downtown hotel in Cleveland because my wife, Hannah, had family flying in, and we wanted something easy: valet parking, elevators, no barns, no backyards, no weather stress. The ceremony was already done, the legal part, the vows, the photos where everyone smiles like their mouth is fine even if their stomach is doing flips, and I had made it through all that thinking the worst of the day was over. My mom, Elaine, had been weird all morning, not mean, not loud, just tight, like she had decided something and didn't want to discuss it. My brother, Grant, had been overly friendly, slapping my back, calling me man, acting like he was the host. When we walked into the reception room, Hannah squeezed my hand and whispered that my parents actually looked happy, and I believed her for about 60 seconds. It started with little moments that made no sense until they stacked up. The DJ announced us, Hannah and Mark, and half the room cheered. Then the other half sort of clapped like they were at a charity luncheon. My parents did not stand. They stayed seated, smiling toward Hannah, and my mom lifted her phone to take a picture of Hannah alone like I was not attached to her. I leaned in and said, "Hey, can you take one with both of us?" And she lowered the phone and said, "Sure, honey," to Hannah, then stood up and walked away to talk to my aunt. I told myself she was nervous, that older people get weird at weddings, that I was reading too much into it. And I took Hannah to our table where our names were printed on a card, my name first, her name second, because that's how the planner said it. Grant came over with a drink and said, quietly, "You should just roll with it tonight." And I said, "Roll with what?" And he smiled like I had asked him what gravity was. He leaned closer and said, "Mom and Dad are sensitive right now. Just do not poke the bear." And then he patted my shoulder and turned away before I could ask what bear he was talking about. Hannah watched him leave, then looked at me and mouthed, "What was that?" And I shook my head because I didn't want to turn our reception into a therapy session. When the salad came out, my dad stood up again and did a short speech about family and new chapters, and he thanked Hannah for joining us, and he thanked her parents for raising such a wonderful daughter, and he raised his glass to Hannah, and every person at the table nearest us turned toward her. I said, "Dad," and I gave him a polite smile that probably looked like my face was glued on, and he nodded at me without changing his words, like I was a guest who had spoken out of turn. I felt heat in my ears and I stared at the butter knife on my plate, because if I stared at him, I was going to do something stupid like ask him what the hell he was doing in front of 200 people. Hannah tried to save it in the quiet way she always does, by touching my wrist under the table, by speaking gently, by being the only adult when other people choose chaos. She said maybe he is just emotional and forgot, and I said he didn't forget how to say my name for 34 years, and she squeezed my wrist harder like she was trying to keep me tethered to the chair. I got up to find my mom near the bar where she was laughing with Grant and my Aunt Marcy, and I walked straight up and said, "Can you stop ignoring me?" And my mom turned her head slightly, like she had heard a sound behind her, and then she looked back to Grant and asked him if he wanted another drink. I stepped into her line of sight and said, "Mom, look at me." And she looked at Hannah over my shoulder and said, "Sweetheart, are you having fun?" And Hannah, bless her, said, "I am. But Mark is upset." And my mom made a face like Hannah had mentioned the weather. Grant took my elbow and guided me a few steps away like I was a drunk cousin. He whispered, "You are making this worse." And I said, "What is this?" And he said, low and sharp, "You know exactly what this is about." I said, "I don't." And he stared at me for a second like I was either lying or hopeless. Then he said, "Talk to Dad after the first dance, not now." And he walked away again, leaving me in the middle of the room while the DJ played something cheerful that suddenly sounded fake. I went back to our table and tried to breathe through my nose like I was in a yoga class, but my chest kept doing that tight thing where your body knows you are about to lose it even if you are still smiling. Hannah's dad, Rob, leaned over and asked if everything was okay, and I told him, "Yeah, family stuff, nothing you need to worry about." And he nodded like he believed me because he is polite, but his eyes stayed on me longer than usual. The first dance was supposed to be safe. You stand there. You sway. You let everyone watch. You pretend the world is simple for 3 minutes. The DJ called us out, and Hannah and I walked to the floor, and I saw my mom lift her phone again, and I thought, fine, take your photo, at least look at me for that. The song started, Hannah smiled up at me, and I tried to match her, and then I saw my parents stand and move toward the edge of the dance floor, not to watch us, but to face the room like they were the couple being celebrated. My dad raised his hand, and someone handed him a microphone, and the DJ lowered our song, and my dad said, "Everyone, can I have your attention?" And my stomach dropped because I knew no good announcement starts like that. He said, "We have a special moment tonight. We want to welcome Hannah into our family officially." And he gestured toward her like I was not holding her. And then he said, "Hannah, we are so proud of you, and we hope you feel supported, and we know you have been through a lot." And he paused like he was waiting for applause. People clapped. Hannah looked confused because she had no idea what he was talking about, and I turned my head toward my dad and mouthed, "What are you doing?" And he kept talking. He said, "Sometimes families have to make hard choices for the sake of stability." And he said, "We are grateful for Grant for stepping up when it mattered." And he pointed at my brother, and Grant smiled modestly like he was accepting an award. And then my dad said, "And we are grateful that Hannah has agreed to move forward with grace." And I felt Hannah stiffen in my arms like she had been splashed with cold water. The song was still playing softly. The room was clapping, and I was standing there on the dance floor holding my wife, while my father praised my brother at my wedding reception, and nobody was looking at me like I was the groom. They were looking at me like I was an accessory in a story I didn't know. After the dance ended, Hannah pulled me toward the hallway outside the ballroom, her nails digging into my hand, and she said, "Mark, what is he talking about?" And I said, "I have no idea," and the way she stared at me made my stomach flip, because she didn't believe me even though it was true. She said, "Your brother told me something last week, and I thought it was just weird family drama," and my heart slammed against my ribs because I had missed a whole conversation. I asked, "What did he tell you?" And she hesitated, then said, "He said your dad paid for most of this wedding and there was a condition," and I felt my mouth go dry because my dad had not paid for most of it. Hannah and I had, with a little help from her parents who insisted, and I said, "What condition?" And Hannah's voice went smaller, like she hated saying it out loud. She said, "Grant said your parents wanted you to sign something after the wedding, something about the family business, and he said if you didn't, they would make it clear you were not part of the family anymore. And he said they would not make a scene, they would just act like you were not there." And I stared at her, because my brother had described what was happening in real time, like he had rehearsed it, like he had planned it. I heard my dad's voice behind us, calm, too calm, saying, "Mark, you need to stop hiding in the hallway and come back in." And I turned and saw him standing there with my mom and Grant, all three of them lined up like a committee, and my dad looked at Hannah and said, "Sweetheart, can you give us a minute?" And Hannah said no, and her voice cracked on the no. My dad's eyes flicked to me finally, and he said, "Are you ready to be reasonable?" And I said, "Tell me what this is." And my mom said, "Don't raise your voice." And I said I wasn't raising my voice, but my hands were shaking and I couldn't stop them. And Grant said, "You are making Hannah uncomfortable." And Hannah snapped, "I am uncomfortable because you are all acting insane." And Grant's face flashed with anger and then smoothed out again like he had practice. My dad said, "We are not doing this here." And I said, "You already are. You started it on the dance floor." And my dad leaned in close enough that I could smell his aftershave and said, "Sign what we ask you to sign after tonight, and we will move on. Or keep fighting, and you will find out how alone you really are." And then he stepped back and smiled at a passing guest like nothing happened. Hannah's parents were walking toward us then, Rob and Diane, and my dad's smile grew wider because he loved an audience when it made him look controlled. Rob asked, "Everything okay?" And my dad said, "Of course, just father-son stuff." And Diane looked at Hannah and saw her face, really saw it. And she said, "Hannah, do you want to leave?" And Hannah looked at me like she was asking if I could handle it. And I nodded because I could not handle staying. We walked back into the ballroom to grab our bags from the sweetheart table, and the room buzzed like nothing was wrong, like the music and the lighting could erase a family turning on their own kid. My mom stood at the cake table with my aunt and gestured for Hannah to come take a photo, and she did not look at me once, not once. And I watched my wife stand next to my mother while I stood behind them like a stranger. Grant leaned toward my ear as I reached for our bag and said, "You can still fix this if you stop being stubborn." and I turned and said, "What did you tell her?" And he smiled and said, "I told her the truth." And then he added, "The part you never tell anyone." And I felt my vision narrow because I had no idea what part he meant, and the last thing I saw before we pushed through the doors was my dad raising his glass again and saying, "To Hannah, to family, to loyalty," and the room cheering like I had already disappeared. In the elevator down to the lobby, Hannah finally said it, quiet and flat. She said, "What did you never tell anyone? Mark, what is he talking about?" And the doors closed before I could answer, and I realized I didn't even know what lie my own brother was about to hand her next. At home, Hannah kicked off her shoes like she wanted to peel the whole night off her skin, and I sat on the edge of our bed still in my tux, bow tie loosened, jacket on the floor, staring at my phone because it kept vibrating with messages that were not from my parents. Friends texted, "Are you okay?" And that was weird, and your dad made a strange speech, and I could not answer any of them because I didn't have language for what had happened without sounding like I was exaggerating. Hannah opened her phone too, and I heard her inhale sharply. Then she said, "Mark, your mom just posted a picture," and I looked, and it was a photo of Hannah smiling by the cake, my mom's hand on her shoulder, my dad beside them. And the caption said, "Welcome to the family, Hannah, we are so proud of you." And my name was nowhere, not tagged, not mentioned, like I was a vendor. I called my dad. Straight to voicemail. I called my mom. Straight to voicemail. I called Grant, and he picked up on the second ring like he had been waiting. And he said, "You ready to talk like an adult now?" And I said, "What did you tell my wife?" And he said, "I told her about the trust," and my stomach dropped because that word had weight in my life that Hannah didn't fully know yet. He said, "I told her how Grandpa left you the controlling shares when you were 25, and I told her how Dad has been running the company on borrowed time. And I told her that if you keep those shares, you can burn the whole family down, and I told her that is why you have always been treated carefully until now." I stared at Hannah because she was watching me with her mouth slightly open like she was trying to match the words to a version of me she knew. I hadn't hidden that my grandfather had left me something, but I had never gone into details because it felt gross to discuss money like it was a personality trait, and because my parents had made it clear they didn't want me talking about it. Grant kept talking, voice smooth, like he was reading a script. He said, "Mom and Dad need those shares transferred to me. Mark, they need it clean. And you were supposed to sign after the wedding because everyone would be happy and sentimental, and you would stop playing hero, and you didn't. So they decided to show you what it looks like when you are not the center of anything." And I said, "You used my wedding as leverage." And he said, "Leverage is what families do when one person thinks he is above the group." Hannah said, "Mark, what shares, what company?" And I held up a hand because I needed Grant to keep talking long enough for me to understand the trap. I said, "Why now?" And Grant said, "Because Dad is under audit, because the bank is sniffing around, because there are loans you don't know about, because your signature can save him or sink him, and because you marrying Hannah means you might finally stop taking their calls and start building a life where they can't control you. So they had to make sure you understood they still can." My hands were shaking so hard my phone rattled. And I said, "I'm hanging up," and Grant said, "If you hang up, Dad will show Hannah the email," and my heart stopped for half a beat. And I said, "What email?" And he chuckled and said, "The one where you agreed to be the guarantor, the one you sent from your old work account." And I couldn't breathe because I had never sent any email like that. Not ever, not in my life. Hannah's face changed in a way I will never forget, not anger yet, not betrayal yet, but fear, because she heard the confidence in my brother's voice, and she could tell he had something. She said, "Mark, did you sign something?" And I said no. And she said, "Did you ever send an email about loans?" And I said no. And Grant laughed again like we were both cute for denying it. He said, "Dad has it printed. He will bring it by tomorrow. He will be calm. He will act like he is trying to protect Hannah. He will say he kept it quiet until after the wedding because he didn't want to ruin her day. And he will say he can fix it if you just do what you should have done in the first place." And then he said, "Sleep well," and he hung up. Hannah sat down hard on the bed, like her legs had stopped cooperating, and she said, "Mark, if there is a forged email out there with your name on it, this is not just family drama." And I nodded because she was right. But my brain was stuck on one thing. The way Grant had been so sure, the way my parents had moved in sync, the way the ignoring at the reception hadn't been an impulsive tantrum. It had been a tactic. I told Hannah the truth as clean as I could. No speeches, no self-pity, just the facts I had avoided because they felt messy. My grandpa owned a small manufacturing company, not glamorous, mostly contracts for parts that nobody thinks about. And when he died, he left his shares split in a way that made me the deciding vote, which meant my dad could keep acting like he was in charge, but only as long as I stayed passive. I had stayed passive because I didn't want to be that guy, the kid who shows up and kicks his dad out, and because my dad told me the company needed stability, and because my mom cried when I asked questions, and because Grant always acted like business was his thing, and I figured, fine, let them run it, I will live my life. I will just keep the shares quiet. Hannah listened without interrupting. Then she said, "They plan tonight," and I nodded. And she said, "Your brother threatened to make me think you committed fraud," and I nodded again. And she said, "What do we do?" And I said, "We don't wait for tomorrow." And I grabbed my laptop because the only way to beat people who plan is to move faster than them. I logged into my old work email, the one I barely used, the one my dad had insisted stay active because family business, and I checked sent items, and there were emails I had never sent from my account to my dad, with language that sounded like my dad trying to imitate me. There was one that said I am good to guarantee the new line of credit, and another that said you can sign for me if needed, and my stomach turned because it wasn't just one, it was a pattern. Hannah leaned over my shoulder, her hand covering her mouth, and she said, "Mark, this is insane." And I said, "Yes," and I scrolled up to check IP logs where I could, and saw locations that were not ours, not even close. I called my friend Maya, who works in IT security, because I didn't want to call a lawyer friend yet, not until I knew what kind of fire we were standing in. Maya answered groggy, and I said, "I need you to tell me if my email was compromised." And she said, "Right now?" And I said, "Yes." And I heard her sit up, heard her switch into work mode, and within 20 minutes she had me forward headers, change passwords, and pull access history. She said, "Someone has been logging in from a device registered in your dad's office building." And she said, "You need to preserve everything, screenshots, logs, dates." And she said, "Do not confront them without counsel, because if they are forging your authorization on loans, they are capable of saying you did it." When I hung up, Hannah was pale, but her voice was steady, and she said, "We need a lawyer tomorrow morning." And I said, "I know." And then she added, "And we need to decide what kind of marriage we want, because I did not sign up to be threatened on my wedding night." And I felt that sentence in my bones, not because she was blaming me, but because she was drawing a line for both of us. I slept maybe 2 hours, waking up every time my phone buzzed, expecting my parents at the door, expecting Grant's smug voice on voicemail. In the morning, there was a knock, and my body jolted like someone had hit a switch. I opened the door, and it was not my dad. It was my Aunt Marcy, my mom's sister, holding a coffee cup and looking like she had aged 10 years overnight. She said, "Can I come in?" And I said, "Why are you here?" And she said, "Because your mother is spiraling and your father is furious and your brother is celebrating, and I can't watch this anymore." Hannah stood behind me in a sweatshirt, hair a mess, eyes sharp, and Marcy looked at her and said, "I am sorry." And Hannah said, "So are we." And Marcy nodded like she deserved that. Marcy sat at our kitchen table and said, "Last night was supposed to break you." And I said, "It did not. It just made it clear." And Marcy said, "Your dad has been borrowing against the company for years to keep up appearances." And she said, "Grant knows." And she said, "Your mom knows enough to feel sick, but not enough to stop it." And she said, "The newest loan is bigger than the others, and the bank asked for proof you were on board." And she looked at me with wet eyes and said, "They used your account. Because they have always used you. They just usually did it quietly." Hannah asked, "Did you know about the ignoring plan?" And Marcy swallowed and said, "Your mom practiced it. She said it would show Mark he cannot embarrass us by refusing. And she said it would keep the guests focused on Hannah so no one would accuse them of being cruel." And Marcy looked down at her hands and said, "I told her it was sick." And she said, "Your mom said, it is not cruel, it is consequences." I felt my jaw tighten so hard it hurt. And I said, "What else?" And Marcy hesitated, then said, "Grant has been telling your dad that you are unstable, that you panic, that you are dangerous to the business." And she said, "He has been pushing them toward cutting you out for years, but they could never do it because your grandfather's will was airtight." Then she looked up and said, "The only way to get your shares is to make you sign, or to make you look like you committed a crime so you will be desperate for a deal." And she said, "That is why they are building a paper trail, and my stomach went cold because it matched exactly what Grant had threatened. Hannah said, "We have logs," and Marcy blinked and said, "Logs," and I told her Maya's findings, and Marcy's shoulders sagged like she was relieved and horrified at the same time. She said, "Then you can stop this, but you need to understand something," and I said, "What?" And she said, "Your dad will not admit it. He will blame you. He will say you gave permission. He will say you forgot. He will say you are confused, and your mom will stand beside him because she cannot stand the idea of being the kind of mother who did this." And then she added, "Grant will throw them under the bus the second it saves him." That last sentence hit me like a punch because it sounded right, and I saw Hannah register it too, her eyes narrowing like she had just found the shape of the enemy. I asked Marcy why she was telling us, and she said, "Because I watched your grandfather try to protect you from your dad's temper for years, and I watched your mother ignore it, and I watched you keep showing up anyway." And she said, "I can't fix what I enabled, but I can keep you from being crushed by it now." When Marcy left, she hugged Hannah first, then me, and her hug was tight and fast like she was afraid to linger. Hannah closed the door and said, "Okay, we do this clean," and by clean she meant lawyers, paperwork, evidence, not screaming in a ballroom. We went to a lawyer that afternoon, a business litigator named Kevin who had calm eyes and a habit of repeating facts back like he was building a wall brick by brick. He told us not to delete anything. He told us to stop engaging with Grant. He told us to send a formal notice to the company's bank and to the board, and he told us to prepare for my family to act like I was attacking them for no reason. That night my dad finally called. He left a voicemail, and his voice was soft, almost tender, like he was leaving a message for a neighbor. He said, "Mark, we need to talk. We have a way to fix this. Do not let outside people poison you against your family." And he said, "Come to the office tomorrow at 9, alone." And he said, "Hannah does not need to be involved." I played it out loud, and Hannah said, "Yeah, I'm definitely coming." And she said it with a smile that scared me a little because it was the smile she uses when someone thinks she is easy to manipulate. At 9 the next morning, we walked into the office together, Hannah holding my hand like she was making a statement, and the receptionist looked surprised because my family had already told her I was not expected. My dad came out, saw Hannah, and his face tightened. Then he smoothed it and said, "Hannah, good morning," and he did not say my name. He led us into a conference room where Grant was already seated, legs crossed, smiling like he had won something, and my mom sat beside him like she was there for moral support. There were papers on the table, neat stacks, signature tabs. My dad said, "Mark, we can put last night behind us." And I said, "Start by saying my name like I exist," and my mom flinched, but my dad ignored that and said, "We are offering you a simple transfer. You sign your shares to Grant. We set up a monthly payout for you, and you and Hannah can go live your life. No stress, no responsibility." Grant chimed in and said, "It is generous." And Hannah said, "It is insulting," and Grant's eyes flicked to her like she had broken a rule. I slid my phone across the table and said, "I have login records. I have forged emails. I have an IT specialist who traced access to this building." And my dad's smile froze, then cracked. Then he leaned back and said, "You are making accusations you can't prove." And I said, "I can." And my mom whispered, "Mark, please." And I said, "You ignored me at my wedding. Don't say please now like you are a victim." Grant laughed softly and said, "You always were dramatic." And I looked at him and said, "Did you plan the ignoring?" And he shrugged and said, "It was effective, wasn't it?" And my chest tightened because he was not even pretending anymore. Hannah said, "You tried to scare me into thinking my husband committed fraud." And Grant said, "I tried to help you see what you married into." And Hannah leaned forward and said, "I married into a family that uses humiliation as a strategy, and I am not impressed." My dad's tone hardened. He said, "If you walk out without signing, you will force us to take steps to protect the company." And I said, "You mean you will accuse me of authorizing your loans?" And he said, "I mean you will regret dragging outsiders into family business." And Kevin, our lawyer, walked in right then because we had told them he would be nearby, and my dad's eyes widened. And he said, "You brought a lawyer?" And I said, "You brought forged documents to my wedding." So yeah, Kevin sat down, introduced himself, and began talking in that controlled way lawyers do when they are laying out consequences without raising their voice. He said, "We have reason to believe unauthorized access occurred." He said, "We are preserving evidence." He said, We are notifying relevant parties. And he said, if any attempt is made to accuse Mark of wrongdoing, we will respond aggressively. My dad's face went red, and he said, this is blackmail. And Kevin said, no, this is risk management. Grant stopped smiling. He looked at my mom and said, are you going to let him do this? And my mom looked at me like she wanted to apologize and also wanted me to disappear so she could breathe again. She said, Mark, just sign. And her voice broke on sign. And I said, you taught me to stand up for myself when kids bullied me. Do you remember that? And she stared at the table like she couldn't afford to remember. Then Kevin dropped the twist that changed the room. He said, we also reviewed the bylaws, and as majority voting shareholder, Mark can call an emergency meeting and replace the acting CEO, effective immediately. And my dad's head snapped up, and he said, you wouldn't. And I looked at him and realized I finally could, not out of revenge, but out of survival. Grant started talking fast, saying Mark doesn't know anything about operations, saying Mark will destroy jobs, saying Mark is emotional. And I said, you used my wedding to try to steal from me. You don't get to lecture me about stability. My dad stood up, chair scraping, and for a second I thought he might slam his fist on the table. But he didn't. He just pointed toward the door and said, get out. And my mom said, please stop. And Grant said, you are choosing her over us. And Hannah said, he is choosing himself, which is what you all hate. We walked out with Kevin, and my heart was hammering like I had just sprinted, and Hannah held my hand so tight my fingers tingled. In the parking lot, Hannah said, are you ready to pull the trigger? And I looked at the building and said, I don't want to hurt employees. And she said, then don't. Replace your dad with someone competent, keep the job safe, and stop letting your family hold you hostage with guilt. We did the emergency meeting. It was ugly but legal. My dad showed up with anger and charm like he could out-talk any room. Grant showed up with charts like he was already in charge. My mom sat behind them like a shadow. And I showed up with Kevin and an interim CEO candidate who had actually run companies without treating people like chess pieces. My dad tried to paint me as unstable, but Kevin presented the access evidence and the email inconsistencies, and the board members, people who had avoided family fights for years, finally had to admit that what was happening was dangerous for the company. My dad was removed as acting CEO by afternoon. He walked out of the building without looking at me, just like the night before, except now it didn't feel like he was erasing me. It felt like he was running out of tricks. Grant cornered me near the elevator and said, you think you won, but you just made enemies you cannot handle. And I said, I already had enemies. I was just pretending I didn't. And he said, you will lose your wife over this. And Hannah stepped beside me and said, no, he won't. And Grant's face flickered with something like panic before he masked it again. That weekend, my parents sent a group text to the whole family saying I had betrayed them, that I had been manipulated by Hannah's family, that I was power-hungry, that I had kicked my own father out for money, and I watched cousins and uncles reply with shocked emojis and vague messages about praying for healing. My Aunt Marcy texted me privately and said, I'm sorry, I tried. And then she sent one more message that made my stomach drop again. She said, your dad is going to the police to claim you hacked your own account to frame him. And she said, Grant is pushing him to do it. Kevin was ready. He had already advised us to file a report first, to document that we believed unauthorized access happened, to put our version on record before my family could twist it. So I went to the station, sat in a plastic chair in my wedding week like I was there for a traffic ticket, and explained that my family had used my credentials without permission to authorize financial activity. The officer listened, asked questions, and took it seriously enough to write it up, not because he cared about my family drama, but because fraud is fraud even when it wears a polo shirt and calls itself tradition. The hardest part was not the legal stuff. The hardest part was the quiet moments where Hannah would stare at her ring like it had become heavier, where she would ask, how long have they been doing this to you? And I would say, my whole life in different ways. And she would say, why did you keep showing up for them? And I would not have a clean answer that didn't make me sound weak. One night she said, when your mom ignored you at the cake table, I felt like I was standing with people who would step over you if you fell. And I said, that's what it felt like. And she said, I don't want that around our future kids. And I said, me neither. And the word kids hung in the air like a decision. A month later, the company's audit found irregularities that were not mine, and my dad's bank accounts were frozen pending review, and Grant stopped calling, because threats don't work well when lawyers are involved and evidence exists. My mom finally came to our house alone on a Tuesday night. No makeup, no jewelry, looking like she had been squeezed dry. She stood on the porch and said, "Can I come in?" And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because I don't know who I am if I am not loyal to your father." And I said, "You could start by being loyal to your son." And she flinched like the word son burned. She sat at our kitchen table and said, "I didn't think they would really erase you like that." And I stared at her and said, "You practiced it." And she covered her face with her hands and whispered, I know. And Hannah stood by the sink and said, "What did you think would happen when you treated him like furniture?" And my mom started crying, the quiet kind that sounds like someone trying not to be heard. My mom said, "Your father told me if we didn't get the shares, we would lose everything." And I said, "You were willing to lose me instead." And she shook her head and said, "I thought you would give in." And I said, "At my wedding?" And she whispered, "Yes." And then she looked up and said, "I hate that I did it, but I also hate that you made me choose." And I said, "I didn't make you choose. You chose a long time ago." She asked if there was a way back. I wanted to say yes because a part of me still wanted a normal mom, the kind who asks if you ate dinner and means it. But then I remembered her eyes sliding past me at the bar, her voice calling Hannah sweetheart like I was nothing, and I felt that old familiar ache, the one that keeps you chasing approval you never get. I said, "I don't know," and Hannah didn't jump in. She just stood there, letting me answer it as myself, not as a hurt kid. After my mom left, Hannah and I sat on the couch and stared at the dark TV screen because we didn't feel like watching anything. And she said, "Do you feel better?" And I said, "I feel lighter and sadder at the same time." And she said, "That's real." And then she said, "Your family tried to make me the wedge, but I won't be." And I said, "They still might keep trying." And she said, "Then we keep choosing what we want." And I believed her because she had already proved it by walking out of my reception with me while everyone else stayed to eat cake. A few weeks after that, Grant emailed me from a new address, short and polished. He said he was willing to talk. He said he wanted to move past conflict. He said he hoped we could repair things. Kevin read it and said, he is scared. And Hannah read it and said, he wants something. I stared at the email and realized the moral dilemma wasn't about whether I could ruin them, because the law and the audit had already done plenty. It was about whether I would become the kind of person who uses power the way they tried to use it on me. I never replied. Not yet. Some days I want to send him every piece of evidence and say you don't get to rewrite this. And other days I want to let him sit in silence the way I sat in silence at my own wedding reception while my family pretended I didn't exist. The weird part is that the silence used to scare me, and now it feels like a tool I finally learned how to hold. We have our wedding photos back, the ones the photographer took when he thought he was capturing joy, and when Hannah flips through them, she pauses on one shot where my mom's hand is on Hannah's shoulder and my face is partly out of frame. Hannah showed it to me and said, "This is the night they tried to erase you." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "They failed, because I remember every second, and I'm still here." And I leaned my head against hers and thought about how being seen by one person can undo years of being treated like you are optional. Sometimes I wonder what my dad tells himself now, whether he still thinks he was protecting the family, whether he believes his own story, whether he regrets anything besides getting caught. Sometimes I wonder if my mom will ever call me and say my name like it matters. Sometimes I wonder if Grant will come back with a new plan, a new angle, a new lie. What I know is that the next time anyone tries to make me disappear, it won't be in a ballroom. It won't be in front of an audience eating cake. It will be in a courtroom where pretending is expensive and where my name has to be spoken out loud.